So welcome back, everybody, or welcome to the Full Cup of Coffee with Kelly conversation, where I am joined with elementary educator Dora Chams, as well as Dr. Susan Rodgers, psychologist and educator at University of Western Ontario. So thank you to both of you again for joining me in such an important and critical conversation as educator well-being is. This is I have to admit that and be fully transparent that I am not an educator. I'm a mental health professional. I have never taught in a classroom. I have never had the experience of teaching in a classroom. And so which is why we have Dora here to really kind of help us bring that voice forward. And so really appreciate your time, Dora, in really helping us center that educator voice in the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And that being said, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is interesting, but well-being for people who care for children is, and for the care for the caregivers is such an important topic for me as a professional, but also because I've had my own experiences of falling flat on my face and in the care of others and having to scrape myself up off the pavement in order to learn some things and carry on and still love my profession and still be able to go forward. So, that's part of why this is such a favorite conversation of mine. And we need to take care of our teachers. We need to take care of our educators. So, so with all of that being said, I'm thinking we've already started talking a little bit in the sip of coffee about what the challenges have been for educators at this time. And Dora, you talked about worry, you talked about uncertainty. I'm wondering if we could talk just a little bit more about what you yourself and your colleagues, I know you can't speak for everybody, but what you understand are the things that you and your colleagues are sort of common experiences that you're going through right now in this time.
Yeah, I think, as you said, that, different people experience different things, but in terms of some commonalities of what I'm hearing from a lot of people, it's just the uncertainty around really everything in education, from logistical things like getting students their things, their belongings, to doing report cards, to try and connect with families, knowing when to when you feel sometimes, it almost feels sometimes like you're badgering families by calling, and you're walking that fine line between you really just want to check in and say hello, but they feel sometimes, pressure to do work, and lots of these kinds of challenges I think people are trying to grapple with. And, also the feeling of not sort of knowing, what's the right thing to do, what's the right balance. You see lots of things online where other educators are doing things, and you kind of wonder, should I be doing that? Am I doing enough? So there's all this uncertainty around, what sort of we perceive as the right thing to do. And I really think that there is no right thing to do, that we just, it's okay not to know what to do, that to just sort of put your heart forward and your best effort forward. And that's enough, that you need to, also take care of yourself. And it's very important that it's enough, that what we do is enough and needs to be valued and validated, I think.
I'm hearing lots of worries, lots of, I'm sitting with a lot of uncertainty. I'm also hearing, as a professional, am I good enough? Am I doing what I am supposed to be doing as a teacher? As something you take a great deal of pride in, and so I'm curious, like, Susan, if you have, as you're sitting and listening to Dora talk, if you have some thoughts related to what Dora has shared.
Sure, and I think that one of the biggest challenges in the that notion of self-care is having self-empathy and being able to push back a little on the guilt and on the feeling that you're not enough, as you said, Dora, because you can think about this as, I need to work harder because this work is really difficult for me. But in actual fact, the work is really hard. It's just hard work.
Period.
Right? Yeah. And so it's not about a lack of anything in an educator. It is the complexity, the uncertainty of the work. And one of the things that I think when we get stressed, when we get frustrated and worried about our own abilities, is we can lose that ability to be flexible, because we just start worrying about meeting somebody else's goals or somebody else's idea of what is right or what is needed. What I suggest is that, as caring professionals, educators, and go back to those values that brought them to teaching in the first place. They really set for themselves what are your priorities for both yourself and your students, and to let that lead you out of that place of uncertainty and to a place where you're feeling that what you're doing is enough. That if you're working on building and maintaining those relationships with your students across a remote access kind of world, that's enough. Right?
So thanks for mentioning that concept, Susan, of self-empathy or self-compassion, in terms of offering ourselves some grace around these are not normal times, and so we do the best that we can with what we've got. Because another piece of educator well-being is that, like, the educators have a life outside of their job as well, and all of the things that are impacting outside of just trying to figure out how to teach kids during remote learning, families and responsibilities and everything else that comes into play, that can really, I would imagine, because that's been my experience too in my own world, that can really weigh heavy on, am I doing good for anybody here? Like, am I doing enough for anybody? I don't know if Dora, whether that rings true for you at all.
Absolutely. And I also think that, educators in general are very driven in order to, move kids forward, but not just academically, but socially and all of those, emotionally and all of those other things. And, we're always trying to, make things better for people in general. I think that, this is one of those professions that, as Susan said, it was one of your core values when you go in. And this, it's second guessing our stuff, because we're usually, sort of at the helm or appearing to be at the helm. And, when there's no helm to hold on to anymore, I think that we question that, am I effective? Am I doing anything for anybody? I think that that's something that people grapple with all the time as educators.
Yeah, wow. It's hard to sit in the mess of it, because it's messy, isn't it? And it's hard to sit in the mess of it when what you value is being a knowledge holder and a knowledge giver. And this is a really messy time for sure. Yeah.
I think too that when we're in that really difficult, messy place, because we're helpers, we're often motivated to action. When being, taking action is not always what's needed. Being present, bearing witness to your own discomfort, to the discomfort of your students. I mean, validation is about the most important thing we can do for one another. I see you, I hear you, right? Can be so important. It doesn't always have to be doing something.
Yeah, it is doing something actually,
It is
isn't
doing
it?
something. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
being with is doing
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that leads me to, and I'm interested, Susan, about your sort of thoughts on this idea that we've talked about educators being helping professionals, being givers, being knowledge keepers and deliverers, being, caring for our kids every single day, having relationships with kids. And having relationships with kids comes with, there's some labor involved in that. And I've been in education as a mental health professional for 10 years, and it's always been really interesting and fascinating to me that that's not often a conversation that we have or that we dive into, is the emotional labor
Right.
that is required of educators. There's so much more than just teaching curriculum, because you're teaching curriculum to little humans who have stories and lives. So I know that you have some things to say about that, Susan. So yeah, I'm curious if you want to comment on that piece.
Absolutely. And I think that, we talk about emotional labor or moral distress as being experienced by, in this case, an educator, when we're working within a system that does not operate, does not hold the same values as we do. So, when you're working within a system that's telling you, no, you have to teach 120 children this topic, or you have to do it a certain way, and you don't have, you can't be doing this, you must be doing that. And if those things are really at odds with your values of creating those relationships of, because we know that the one caring adult in the life of a child can make all the difference, right? And educators are there because they want to be a caring adult in the life of a child, but maybe the system that you work in doesn't support that, and that creates this sense of moral distress. And at that point, we tend to have a couple of choices. We can try to become what the system wants us to, kind of internalize the criticism, internalize those ideals that we don't really agree with, or we can feel not adequate, just blame ourselves, right? And so that really can lead us to a place where we question, why am I doing this? It's so hard. It's so hard.
Thank you. Yes. And Dora, what I'm curious about your thoughts on that concept, like as an educator, that concept of emotional labor, and what your heart is involved in the work. Your heart is involved in the work, which means you have feelings about it, which means you're impacted by it. And so I'm wondering, you've had many years in education. Yeah, over 20? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what would you say in your experience is that the emotional labor of teaching?
Yeah, Susan said so many things that resonated with me. The push to push home the curriculum, which of course is valid, but the other push, the other need that you have to have the relationship with the students in order to do that, and that whole moral dilemma of, well, yes, I need to cover this, but my student is not there. They need other things. And I think, most educators will agree that relationship is the most important before anything else happens in terms of curriculum. And I think probably one of the biggest challenges with well-being, and I spoke to this earlier, is not having that connection. So you really feel it in terms of, those whole feelings of inadequacy or not doing enough, because you know that face-to-face connection is gone. So the emotional labor in teaching is far greater than the curriculum, in my opinion. And we were joking earlier about your work, social work, and Susan's work in the faculty, and you know how my dad had mentioned to me about I had wanted to be a social worker, considering it, and he said to me, you know, social work, well, what do you want to do that for? You're going to listen to people's problems all day. Go be a teacher. You know, that's much better for you. And I often chuckle now because he thought that, you know, being a teacher was just walking in, giving the lesson and going, which is what, you know, Susan was talking about. But it isn't that. It's, you know, that's actually the last thing that it is, in my opinion. So we're torn in that, with that emotional labor piece, because it's always present, and it has to be in order to get anywhere with the curriculum. So that's why I think this remoteness is so difficult, because it goes against our nature as educators.
Right. And the worries that you hold for kids, and the things that are sort of the things we don't know what's happening in the life of that child or that child. You know, I've often thought for myself in my profession and my training, and there's lots of conversation about what do I do when I care about my client or a child, and I don't necessarily have control over what happens when they walk out of my office, for example. And how do I go about my life with that worry for somebody else's well-being that I care about? And that's a very much a conversation in my profession. And I'm not sure it always has been in education, a conversation of what are the strategies that I need to use to hold on to this worry and concern and care for children when they walk out of my classroom, virtually or otherwise. So that's the conversation that I'm happy we're entering into at this point, and will be so needed as we're thinking about transitioning back to school, right? In the fall, will be so needed in terms of the worries for our kids. So if we're thinking about, we're thinking about well-being and self-care, and I'm curious, Susan, if you have some thoughts just around what are the like, if we were to leave educators with all of these things that we've just talked about, if we were to leave educators with just some tidbits of thoughts on how to think about your own well-being and self-care right now, I'm wondering what pearls of wisdom you may have.
Well, I think our listeners will decide if they're pearls of wisdom or not. But when I think about dealing with stress, I think, as we mentioned earlier in the sip of coffee, that stress is experienced individually. And how we experience it, what we can do with it, is really going to be informed by our experience with it. If we've been told we're not allowed to be stressed, if we've expressed, being uncomfortable or sad, and people have said, well, what have you got to be sad about? You've got a great job. You've got all of these things, right? So if you have that experience and we internalize that and we tell ourselves, oh, I'm not stressed, I can't be stressed, that's wrong. Right? So everybody comes to this situation individually. But I think it's important to think about the two parts. On one hand, we're wanting to reduce our stress. And how do you reduce the stress? Through self-empathy, I think, is a big one, right? When we think of, for example, what you were talking about, Dora, the online learning and the, helping students, this is a problem that is not of our making. And yet the teacher is there and is the most obvious, visible person who is doing or not doing what other people think they should be doing, right? And so thinking to yourself that, we're doing the best we can. I'm doing the best I can. This problem that I've been handed, I'm doing what I can in the best interests of my students, therefore myself. So having that self-empathy is really important. Having some humility, because this problem is owned by all of us together, right? We're not one person is going to have the solution or be the solution here. We're all part of this together. Being able to reframe it. So as we were talking about earlier, thinking, not thinking that this is hard for me, I need to work harder, but the work is hard. And reminding ourselves that when we catch ourselves going into that place, because that can be really stressful, and really, going at these things with intention. So having that intent to look at the world in ways that are more healthy for us and reduce our stress. On the other side, we have our coping with stress. And Dora, you talked about relationships being so important. And I believe that for all of us, relationships are a really important way that we cope with stress. Understanding ourselves to be part of a community, depending on one another, not individuals who stand alone and are alone. And I think everybody comes to their own ways that work for them, coping with stress. Being outside in nature. A recent study came out that said being outside in nature for at least a half an hour a day is as effective as personal therapy for stress. Right? So being outside, being physically active, all of those things we hear, but also including maybe being creative through music, through art, through drama, through writing. Maybe it's a newfound sense of spirituality, finding a place for yourself there. So really thinking with intention about what ways we can build within ourselves to cope with stress. Do more of the stuff that works, less of the stuff that doesn't. Yeah.
So one of the things that strikes me as thank you, Susan, very much pearls of wisdom. Thank you. One of the things that strikes me as we sort of wrap up our conversation is I really like, Susan, how you framed sort of those self-care, because we talk about self-care a lot, but self-care also implies what you do on your own in the absence of other people. And all of those things are really, really important, that we find what works for us and we do what works for us to reduce our stress. And we also know that any definition of well-being doesn't happen in isolation of each other and of relationships and of caring about each other and of cultivating important connections in our life. So that community care idea is also really important, because we sort of live sometimes in this individualistic society where we think about we've got to go off and do these sort of strategies on our own in the absence of collectively coming together and being with each other, and the value of that on our well-being. So I'm closing with this idea that we need to expand the conversation the best that we can, and balance self-care with community care. And so, this may be a little bit of a soapbox thing for me, but this conversation is so much more than what we've been able to do here. And it's so much more than just a tip sheet of strategies that you slide across the table to somebody and say, go take care of yourself. There are lots of aspects of well-being and self-care that are to be unpacked. And so I really, really appreciate both of your time to even start to have a kernel of a conversation about it that will take us beyond this, and hopefully will provide some people some things to think about. So that being said, because there is more to talk about, Susan Rodger has agreed so graciously to co-facilitate with me some professional learning sessions for educators, ECEs, teachers, EAs, and those sessions will take place online, obviously, on Wednesday, June the 10th and Friday, June the 12th. And so please, once you see this, go onto your employee portal and sign up for a session. And Susan and I would be so happy to be able to sit and have more coffee with Kelly and Susan to really dive more into what we've only started to scratch. So thank you so much, Dora. Thank you for what you do every day for kids. Thank you so much. And Susan, thank you so much for your thinking and your thoughts and your pearls today. So that's Coffee with Kelly. And thanks so much for having me. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.